Today we celebrate the solemnity of the most holy body and blood of Christ, also known as Corpus Christi Sunday. We celebrate this solemn feast of the Eucharist, the source and summit of our faith. The Eucharist, as you know, is so rich in meaning. There is so much to preach about, there's so much to give a talk on. Though after prayerful reflection, I'm going to make only one point: that Jesus Christ is truly present in the Eucharist. Jesus is present, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. And when we celebrate today's solemnity, it's a reminder that Jesus is truly present in our midst, under the appearance of bread and wine in the Eucharist. I'm sure many of us had doubts at one point or another in our lives. Some may have doubts of this now, maybe thinking to themselves, how can a piece of wafer and some wine and a chalice become the body and blood of Christ at Mass? Let us look to St. Paul for an answer to this question. In his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, verses 23 to 26, Paul echoes the words of Jesus when Christ instituted the Eucharist at the Last Supper. We heard Paul allude to this in today's second reading, that at the Last Supper, Jesus instituted the Eucharist, saying, "This is my body." And afterwards, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Now, if we were to read earlier on in the same letter, the first letter of the Corinthians, earlier on in chapter 10, verse 16, St. Paul says the following: "The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not a communion in the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not a communion in the body of Christ?" With this in mind, we see how St. Paul points out to the true reality that Christ is really, truly present in our midst under the appearance of bread and wine, after the words of Christ himself, spoken through a validly ordained Catholic priest at Mass. Now, when I say, I also include the Eastern Catholic priests and the priests of the Orthodox Church, but that's another topic for another time. Through the voice and hands of the priest, Jesus blesses the bread and wine and transforms it into his own body and blood. We call this the transubstantiation. It's a big word stating that through the voice, that at the words of consecration, it is Jesus himself speaking the words through the priest. Through the voice of the priest, the substance of the bread and wine is transformed into the substance of the body and blood of Christ, transformed into the divine substance, and only the appearance of bread and wine remain and its effects. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas spoke a lot about this and wrote a lot about this. You may make reference to St. Thomas Aquinas. This is a great mystery, and it requires faith to really penetrate this reality. And although the Eucharist appears and tastes like bread and wine, it is no longer the same substance. It is the divine substance of the body and blood of Christ. A few weeks ago, I went on a pilgrimage with a group to Rome and Italy, central Italy, And as you know, I gained about 10 pounds from all the pasta, the delicious pasta that they insist on eating. They insist that you eat lots of it. It'll take a few weeks to work it off, but anyway. Besides the great pasta that is offered to us in Italy, there are amazing sites, many pilgrimage sites to go and visit and pray. One of the places we visited is Lanciano. In the Church of St. Francis, we had Mass and prayed before what is known as the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano. This is known as the oldest Eucharistic miracle present in our day. To give a brief background of this, in the 8th century, there was a priest monk of St. Basil who doubted the real presence of the Eucharist, the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. So as he's celebrating Mass, this is the 8th century, after Mass, after the consecration of the bread and wine, the appearance also changed. And he saw before him flesh. And he looked in the chalice, it was blood. God removed the veil so that this priest could pierce into the true reality of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Now, people soon found out and start coming from all over to see this Eucharistic miracle. Keep in mind, this was in the 8th century, and it's still available for us today. That's another miracle, that the flesh hasn't broken down. It's still present, still there for us to come and for people to go and visit and venerate and adore. And it's in a silver and glass reliquary type monstrance. And it's displayed for veneration and adoration in this Church of St. Francis. More on what a monstrance is in a few minutes. What is also interesting is that scientific tests were done on this several years ago, to be precise, in 1971, and discovered that the flesh is heart muscle. And the blood, which it has coagulated into 5 clots, is real human blood. And the blood type is AB. Apparently, the same blood type found on the Shroud of Turin. For those who are unaware of what the Shroud of Turin is, you may do a search on the internet, and it'll give you great details on that. And for those who are keeners, who want to seek the source, that I'm not just speaking this out top of my head, you may look at Lannoli's findings, his studies, 1971, published in Quaderni Sclavo di Diagnostica Clinica e di Laboratori. Okay, that's the article. Took a while. Finally pronounce it. I think I'm almost there. And these studies were confirmed in 1981 by another researcher, Ruggero Bertelli, a professor from the University of Siena. Among others, the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano is permitted by God as a reminder that his Son, Jesus, is truly present in our midst, available for us to come to him, to visit him, who is in the tabernacle of our Catholic churches. Also, we're blessed to have the opportunity to have the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament available to us for adoration. What is that? For those who are not familiar with the exposition of Blessed Sacrament, it is when the sacred host that is consecrated at Mass is placed in this sacred vessel called a monstrance. A monstrance is like a stand that with the sacred host inside of it. It is usually placed on the altar it is placed on the altar for adoration, for all to gaze on Christ and the Eucharist. Now, this is also known as doing a holy hour or going for adoration. Ultimately, what it is an extension of the Mass. When the priest, after consecration, elevates the host, the sacred host, the Eucharist, it's a continuation of that in a monstrance for all to gaze as long as it's available. Now, we're very blessed to have that here at St. John Vianney during the week, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays after the 9 a.m. Mass. And I know St. Francis of Assisi site, they have it available too. I think it's afternoon on Wednesdays around 3, I think, between 3 and 4. Check the bulletin for further details on that. Even though the Blessed Sacrament may not be available or exposed, you can still go to the churches that are open, the Catholic churches, and visit Jesus present in the tabernacle. Now, to give a taste of this devotion, we are going to have the Blessed Sacrament exposed at the end of Mass. And we're going to have a small procession just in here, and then we're going to end with benediction. So Father Brian is going to, through benediction, he's going to omit the final blessing of the priest, because at benediction, it is Jesus himself blessing us with the monstrance, with the Eucharist. After that, then we'll resume like usual with a recessional hymn. Now, my brothers and sisters, I'd like to bring your attention to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 20. The very last verse of Matthew's Gospel, the very last words that Matthew records in his Gospel, the words of Christ before he ascends into heaven. He says, "And behold, I am with you always until the end of the age."